So, Ken Wilber, one of my intellectual heroes, talks about the difference between temporary states and permanent traits. And so, this vibratory scale that you just tested for is really just kind of where your energy is vibrating right now. And we're going to test again after just, 2.5 days of very intense, deep spiritual expansion. So you just get a sense in your own body and through your own musculature and nervous system how easy it is to change your state. But the goal of all spiritual practice is how do we change our traits? And what are the practices that speak to us in such a way that allow us to evolve our personal traits? So, one of the things I was struck with when Catherine was speaking from the Psyche perspective of how they work towards a whole brain experience. And I know Lauda's work, the whole heritage of her family's work is really about, again, a whole brain state of consciousness. And that's what this work we're going to be doing in a very different way, is how do we create a whole mind, a whole brain, a whole body, integrative state experience. And you'll feel it in the connective tissues and bones of your body, as well as ideally in an expanded state. And by the time we leave this evening, you will experience the state of meditation that a Buddhist monk who's been meditating for 30 or 40 or 50 years has when they sit on a cushion. You'll have a taste of that. Now the challenge is, how do you go home with that? And that's the art and science of spiritual practice. So let me get out of the way here. I'm a much better door than I am a window. I've heard that a number of times this evening already. So we talked about whole brain integration, right and left hemispheres. We're going to look at Western consciousness and Eastern consciousness, and how we're in this very exciting time of all the wisdom in the world is on the table for us to choose from and play from. And one of the best books that I've read in a decade and really impacted me is called Destructive Emotions. And it's a book by Daniel Goleman that chronicles 5 days that he spent with the Dalai Lama. And every couple of years, the Dalai Lama hosts a conference. It's limited, it's by invitation only. And they bring the finest minds in science and Eastern mysticism, Buddhism, and they find ways to collaborate and work together. And Destructive Emotions was the topic where they were really exploring what is it that keeps us from our true nature or our ultimate happiness. And ultimate toxic emotions or poisonous emotions, destructive emotions. And they had the top neuroscientists, philosophers from the Western tradition, emotional intelligence experts that were all presenting, as well as some of the top Buddhist instructors in the world. And it was a wonderful, wonderful 5 days. And it was fascinating to me how all the Western traditions zeroed back to Aristotle. And what he wrote about the human condition and the human experience is still very accurate and applicable to us today. Now, when we talk about emotions and emotional states, Aristotle would say that it's absolutely right to be angry at some point. Think about the wrath of Achilles in Homer, where the Buddha and the Dalai Lama would say, no, no, no. So it's a different perspective of how these emotions serve us in our lives. But Aristotle believed that you could still have anger in a rightful way. Now his quote was, anybody can be angry, but to be angry in the right way, with the right person, for the right reason, and express it in the right way is very difficult. Of course, the Course in Miracles says you're never angry for the reason that you think you are. But that's a whole nother Oprah. So we're going to talk about really just happiness. And I mean, ultimately, why are we on the spiritual path? To be happy, to have joy, to have love in our lives. And that's a different path than the path of enlightenment. I mean, that is a real commitment to transcend the self and the limitations of the ego and to actually walk in a liberated way in the world. There is a word in the Greek called eudaimonia, which translates to the good life, it translates to happiness, it translates to flourishing. But it's all about what does it take to be genuinely happy and lead the good life, a life that is worth emulating, of the great heroes of the Greek tradition, the great philosophers, the people who had real meaning in their lives. And then the bodhisattvas, the liberation, the people who again are making a difference in a Eastern Enlightenment tradition. So we're going to play with those two impulses through the week. So kind of lasering in on the eudaimonia, human flourishing. Martin Seligman, who's done a lot of research and some of the most cutting edge recent research on human flourishing and happiness, talks about PERMA, the 5 elements that are so important. Do you have your?
I'm sorry. I apologize. How do you spell that? The Greek word?
Oh, EUDIMONIA. Walt, you just missed it. I started my dance. You have your workbook? Okay. Eudaimonia, EUDIMONIA. Seligman's book called Flourishing is really one of the best books we've read in a couple years. We actually did a study group, some of us together.
The book is titled Flourishing.
Flourishing. Mm-hmm.
You're not helping. I'm going to end up with about 24 books to read before this weekend is over. You know that.
Well, I guess I should have a list of books that you could read before we got here. I didn't even think about that, but you know, if you're like me, like human, flourishing. I've listened to it 3 times on CD and I've read it twice. It had that kind of impact on me. And it really is just the latest Western research on what contributes to happiness. And so these are the 5 elements that, tracing all the way back to Aristotle and the latest research, positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement or mastery. And we're going to talk this weekend specifically about positive emotions versus toxic emotions. And we're going to talk a lot about engagement. Particularly when we get to the heart chakra and shame, one of the things that happen when we experience shame in our life is that we disengage. And we have all sorts of behaviors that come up that keep us from actually engaging in life and the people in our lives and even with ourselves. Yes, Wallace?
No, I was just
okay.
like that thought.
Yes. Shame will be the highlight of tomorrow evening. That's what, I didn't mention that in the brochure, you may have noticed, but...
It should have been your top selling point.
Yeah. Well, it worked for John Bradshaw,
Record the shame and maybe make it a winner on YouTube?
We'll see. Well, yeah. I promise none of these clips will appear on YouTube unless it's just my little dancing routine, to the Beatles. Thank you, Lauda. Uh-huh. And then, of course, our relationships, our loving relationships are very much affected by our ability to have positive emotions and to engage in a really vulnerable and intimate way. And mastery is just one of my favorite things in the world. Our friend George Leonard, who wrote that wonderful little book, The 5 Keys of Mastery, and how we have the things that we commit to over and over in our lives and come back to and practice and achieve and succeed. So Lauda, I know you've been practicing these principles for a very long time. How do you feel about mastery?
I think when it comes to mastery, like anything else, it's something you do over and over and over again.
Mhm.
And that's going to bring confidence and conviction, experience. And as you experience, you build successes. And so I think mastery is not something that typically was going to happen like overnight, but it's something you have a vision towards achieving.
Mhm.
And as you move towards that direction and stay the path and be tenacious about it,
Mhm.
then you're going to get, the benefits and all the wonderful things that come from staying the course,
Mhm.
from being tenacious. And so I always tell people the fastest way to get from here to your outcome is going through the process. It's going through, what it takes to get there.
Mhm.
Now, no shortcuts in that sense, but really enjoy the journey
Mhm.
and be very conscious and mindful of the journey, because that's where the mastery comes in. To be really, really sensitive as to what is going on both externally and internally. Establish those points of reference or those markers along the way. Be able to repeat it over and over and be really a master
Mhm.
of the experience, both internal and external.
Right. For a musician to become a master, they talk about 10,000 hours of practice. Or an athlete to become a master, it's 10,000 hours of practice. That's sort of the golden rule of what do you have the passion for and the love of that you can do for 10,000 hours. So that's a whole nother workshop. Okay, so our destructive, toxic, poisonous, and corrosive emotions are those that cause harm to ourselves and others. So that's what I mean when I mention toxic or destructive or poisonous, are those that cause harm to ourselves and to others. And guess what? Meditation is the one known antidote to the mind's vulnerability to toxic emotions. When the Dalai Lama had all these Tibetan Buddhist scholars with him, there was quite a bit of discussion because in Tibetan, there is no word for emotion. Because they really talk about the body-mind together. Now they talk about 108 mental states that keep you out of an enlightened and liberated experience. And when we, from a Western perspective, look at those 108 states, about 80 of them really are what we would call emotional states. So meditation, we've known since the Buddha, or even before that, with the Tantric masters, that helps us transcend. So here are the 6 different kinds of meditation that have been known to effectively work with these toxic emotional states. These have all been tested. Richard Davidson is a PhD neuroscientist who has done the most neuroscans on meditators to really evaluate what happens in their brain when they're meditating in these different types. One-pointed concentration, which is the most basic form of meditation training. Visualization. Meditations on devotion and kindness, which interestingly in the Buddhist tradition and the Tibetan, it's different than compassion. So cultivating devotion is a little different than cultivating compassion. I would say devotion is more of love, really sensing love. And compassion is a different, higher emotional state. And then I love this, cultivating fearlessness. Deep confidence. That no matter what happens, you have the capacity to be present and to engage. And then my favorite is absorption, or an open state. And you'll have experience of that in about 30 minutes. Scout's honor. Okay, so tapping liberation is actually the technique that we're going to play with all weekend, and helps to straddle both east and west. And we're going to use the sensations in the body. to actually trace back to our earliest memories of different toxic emotions in our lives. We're going to use a technique called EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique, or tapping, to help to neutralize and release the hold of those emotional states in our limbic brains, in our mind, and in our energy fields, and also in the connective tissues of the body. We're going to use the voice dialogue process, and then how to really embody non-dual awareness, or that absorption that I was just talking about. So what is this voice dialogue? Carl Jung was, of course, one of the pioneers in Western psychology, and he talked about active imagination, of using your mind to engage and be able to tease out the distinctions and differences between different subpersonalities or archetypes. Fritz Perls, who pretty much single-handedly created psychological gestalt, used the empty chair technique, where someone who had daddy issues, Fritz would facilitate them to, okay, I want you to stay in that chair over there, and I want you to move to this chair over here, and I want you to be your father. So it really began to tease out that we have these different personalities within us, and we can speak to and from those different places. Hal and Sidra Stone. Hal is a Jungian analyst, very gifted analyst, and his wife Sidra, and they developed a process called voice dialogue, which allows us to speak to many, many different subpersonalities of the psyche. The inner child, the wounded self, the pusher, the inner critic, many different voices. And you sense that each of those voices has a point of view and a perspective of how you should be living your life and what you should do to stay safe. And oftentimes, what was the analogy I like? You've got the handcart, and then you've got the locomotive, and they have very different opinions about what you should do to be safe.
Yes, they do.
Like being in this room about right now. And a lot of us here in this room have studied with Genpo, who is a Zen master, American Zen master, and he developed the big mind, big heart process. And most of what Hal and Sidra Stone did focused on really the aspects of the ego and the self. And what Genpo finally realized is that not only do we have all these multiple voices of the personality, but we have all these 10,000 enlightened voices. In Zen, they've always said you are already always awake. And it's just an immediate shift to be able to live into that awakening. Well, what Roshi realized is that just talking with the ego in a few minutes, and then all of a sudden, all these 10,000 beautiful voices are available to us. And that really integrates Zen, Tibetan, and Vipassana, which is insight meditation.
What?
Insight?
Insight.
Vipassana literally translates into insight. But it's the fastest form of Buddhism in America, growing right now. And then my friend Lee Titus, who's really been studying various aspects of all this for years, she really had an impact on me. She came and spoke here in Houston, and so there's a little piece of her work we're going to play with, and then of course EFT tapping. So EFT literally translates to meridian tapping or emotional acupuncture. It was first sort of discovered by a chiropractor, Roger Callahan, and made famous by a man named Gary Craig. And now Dawson Church has sort of taken over the mantle of really helping to share the word. And there's many famous EFT tapping people. It's amazing. I think there's like 200,000 different certified practitioners around the world who are doing EFT. And lots of anecdotal studies of how it's helping. One of the things that Dawson Church has done is he's very much into clinical trials and studies. And so he has been working with vets returning from Iraq and Afghanistan with post-traumatic stress disorder. And they found that 80% of cases can be treated and resolved with just 10 sessions of EFT tapping. And they've now clinically established that. And they're working now with the Pentagon and with the Veterans Administration to get that accepted, and they've had some success with it. So it's very powerful, but it's really good for helping to neutralize emotions that are stored in the energy field. Okay, so last slide before we dive into it here. So we're going to make some important distinctions, and that is that there's the ego, or the regular self, or the personality, and that lives in the world of polarities. I, you, body, mind, hot, cold. Everything is seen from a prison of me, not me. And then there's the non-dual, or the liberator, enlightened voices, which is that's where unity consciousness happens. And then what we do is we take it up to a whole nother level where we transcend and include. So we come back around to the ego self, the dualistic self, and then how do we then begin to embody and integrate that with that non-dual awareness and experience. Sound fun? Okay, so here are the instructions for our process for the rest of the evening. So I'm going to ask to speak to different sub-personalities in your psyche. And when I do, I just ask you to move in your chair. So I always think in terms of, it's like tuning a radio. It's like you've got AM, you've got FM, you've got satellite, but you've got to tune the dial and get a clear signal. So when you shift in your chair, you actually allow a different perspective to come through. What I've noticed is that the people who have the greatest experience with this work actually do speak. They say something. It's called voice dialogue. When you use your voice, energy actually ripples through your connective tissues. So it helps to anchor that voice into your awareness and into your body. Speak from the I place. I know we're going to speak from the controller at some point. It's always a crowd pleaser. And so instead of, Mary might shift and say, okay, I'm the controller and she's over there. And she thinks I'm a little heavy-handed. Or whatever her experience is of the controller. So allow the voice to, be the voice. Be the innocent child. Be the one who seeks the way. Be big mind. And then if you get stuck, just raise your hand and say, what the hell are y'all talking about? All these people. Like that? You don't have to. You don't have to. I like it when you do, though. So if people are talking and having an experience and you're going, I think I'm in that voice, but it's totally different than what these people are saying, that's very valuable. Or even better, it's like, I'm not going there. Oh no. Very, very valuable. And you're probably not the only one having that experience, so it is helpful if you raise your hand and say, hey, I want to talk. So it allows you to sort of get unstuck. Because one thing we know is we all have our preferences for these voices. And we have the voices that we will go into, or voices that we won't. And we'll talk about disowned voices or personalities tomorrow more. So, questions or comments before we get started? Okay. Well, let's play.